Hello, and welcome to the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Crysler. Each episode, we talk to business leaders and subject matter experts to learn about the challenges they've overcome and the challenges they still face. You'll hear fresh insights, real talk, and get inspiration to grow your business. Hey, everybody. So excited to be welcoming Casey Winans back to the podcast. Casey is the founder and CEO of Full Stride. They specialize in helping growth stage businesses to optimize their warehouse operations. And Casey comes to us with more than 20 years of deploying a WMS or warehouse management systems, and he's seen firsthand how preparation can make or break success. Casey's a strong advocate for clarity over quick tech fixes and focuses on aligning strategy and systems to drive lasting productivity gains. Casey, thanks so much for coming on the Everyday Business Problems Podcast.
Hey, happy to be here, and thanks for having me back.
Yeah, man. I know we've been talking about this before the podcast and across social, but today's topic is, buy or build as it relates to software and more specifically warehouse management systems. So I'm excited to get into this conversation with you.
Yeah, me too. All right, where do we start?
Yeah, I think the best place to start with it is, kind of on the front end strategic place, right? Like when we were just kind of catching up on things, you had brought up, a company that is in a pretty specific niche with a pretty specific requirement, right? And what's interesting about that is, I'd say for most people, it's kind of the first natural thought is like, let's build something, right? Because, all of the off the shelf or kind of configurable, technologies, tools out there maybe don't have the ability to handle this specific requirement. So Let's start there and, chat about just what that looks like from your perspective and kind of that, strategigic outline standpoint.
Right. So, to give you a little more context anyways to folks that are listening here, this came down to what I would call like wire cutting. So electrical company. And in the WMS arena anyways, you're typically picking things that are discrete units like that. So you could go and you could pull a few units from one box and grab a few units from another one and marry them up and you've satisfied the order. Well, with wires, you're pulling from a spool and you're cutting. You don't take two different lengths and give them to the customer because that defeats the purpose, right? So that's one of these complex scenarios, and right out of the gate, that's something that a lot of WMSs don't handle well, right? It's either some type of customization, or you can get it to work that way, but then you break or you complicate something else downstream, right? So it's a game of whack-a-mole to an extent, but so. In that sense, anyways, that was something that helped when we were talking, is that really narrows down their options. And I guess it can kind of feel a little defeating too, right? You might come in with like this preconceived notion you want to work with vendor XYZ, and it turns out they can't do it, right? And then it's like, well, why am I here? Or you bump into another one and it's the same situation. And those are the ones that you've heard about. So you get defeated and you start looking like, well, do we build? Right. And that's that question that we're kind of trying to answer here, is where we go from here. And I'll warn everybody, I am not a fan of building. So I'll just say it right now, kind of plant my flag.
Just get it out of the way, right?
Right. But it's not set in stone. There are caveats, and I can even talk about some of the stories I've had in my past too, to kind of shed some light on that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to put a stamp and make it black and white in terms of yes and no, ones and zeros, right? But yeah, I fall on the same side of the aisle that you do in terms of buy versus build, and really what it comes down to, at least in my experience, and again, it's coming from a person that has built their own technology. In a lot of scenarios. And what I can say, though, to that point is, at some point, there is a real challenge in terms of maintenance kind of, I don't want to say scalability of it, but, the maintenance that is required from an ongoing perspective, and also just kind of, the initial development and continued requirements. Because when you start to build, right, it becomes very challenging to say, where do we stop?
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So what have you seen from your perspective, along those lines, from, that maintenance and, kind of clarifying what the requirements are,
Sure.
if somebody is interested in, perhaps building their own?
Sure. I'll give you an example. I mean, I lived this, a long time ago, 20 years ago. I worked for a small remanufacturer, and they were, to an extent, maybe allergic to buying software, right? Price tags, perceived complexity, but they weren't opposed to hiring some developers and throwing their hat in the ring. And to an extent, I mean, it made sense early on for them in a way where they looked different than most customers would for a typical vendor, right? So they bump into those things where, like, the complexity of the software they were looking at just felt too much, right? It was too high of a hurdle. So they were looking for ways to streamline that. So they invested, they built. But like you indicated, where do you stop? In fact, where do you start, right? It was just this hodgepodge of features to get to a certain level of parity. And then there was no roadmap per se. It was, people knew that they built their own software, which meant that you had people coming from every direction with their pet projects, right? So
Yeah.
it was quite the monstrosity after several years. And that's kind of where, if you look back, like, it wasn't necessarily a core competency of the company, right? There were certain elements of it. There were definitely some pieces that made a lot of sense, and that probably came down to the custom workflows they did on the warehouse floor and the shop floor, where they needed something efficient, and you weren't going to get that from packaged software, at least not back then. 20 years ago, you didn't have this concept of low code, very configurable workflow engines. So you would build something purpose built that way to solve a certain problem, and then feed that information somewhere. So those parts made sense. But beyond that, like I said, you were getting information from every which way, and there was no overarching plan or management layer to really drive and prioritize what was going on. And that's where you got that feature bloat. You got the distractions in terms of that. And instead of really innovating, there was a lot of work to just maintain the system, right? And there was, and with anybody who's built in-house software or something like that before, you get this concept of technical debt, right? After years of doing it, I could have done it better, and it builds up, and then you're trying to do something new in the business, but you're fighting something old. So you have this patchy software, with little weird silos in there, and those things definitely add up. And that was one of the reasons why, when I left, they were just starting to look at packaged software, being that it would free up the IT department to really focus on what was important to the business versus all this mundane stuff, right? So how do we pull out what we've done, put in some packaged software? And at that point in time, they were bumping into some of the challenges I see with my clients, where you're kind of going to, like, the big boy packages at that point. So there's a hurdle for the upfront costs, but then you get an implementation, and you're going to spend some money up front to do it right. And that's actually how one of the vendors they were looking at was a vendor I went to work for when I left that company, and that started my consulting career. So it was just one of those weird, serendipitous kind of moments. But yeah, I'm probably going off on a tangent, so let's bring me back in, man.
No, it's good. I mean, I think, the point about the kind of lack of roadmap, lack of prioritization, the ongoing kind of infrastructure and maintenance costs, all of those are valid, and, likewise have experienced those things. And then you've got the complexity of, kind of brain drain, right, from a variety of reasons. And again, back to your point, like, for most businesses developing any type of software, even if you want to say some of the, low code, no code automations and, RPA, those types of things, right? It's not their core competency. So it really is a challenge when you think about it from a from an efficiency perspective, number one. Number two, something that very few companies think about or even talk about is, security, right?
Mm.
Like 15 years ago, security was a different issue in terms of cyber and, access to IP and even, what devices were connected to the internet.
Right.
Today, that's a whole different ball game. So if you find yourself developing software, to solve a specific problem, or you think that there's potentially a software play in your future, let's say, boy, there, even with the technology that's available from an infrastructure perspective, right? Like the tools that you can use to build these things, there's a ton of consideration to be had for the security of them, the connectivity of them, the kind of user management, and depending on if it's customer facing also, right? Like there's all these layers to unpack with this stuff that, I find don't really get talked about, right? It's just kind of like, to your point, there is no roadmap. We have a problem, we're going to build it, and then we just continue to tack on features onto this thing as new problems highlight themselves.
Yep. For sure, man. The Frankenstein software. And yeah, you got me thinking too, in terms of what's out there now. I'm still a geek at heart, right? I don't do any of this stuff anymore necessarily. I help on the functional front end and then pick technology. But I'll look at some technology coming up and I'm like, that is intriguing. I could have used that 20 years ago. And then my brain instantly, plugs it in here, gets rid of something custom I had done. Like, that's great. But then it turns into this bowl of like integration soup. I don't know. That's a terrible term, but there's something, but that's where my brain goes, of connecting all these cool little platforms. So that's a beast of its own, right? Like it's low code, no code, where you're trying to glue these things together. You get the automation frameworks that share information. That can be a bear too, all around. And then dealing with all those security issues, like you had outlined before, it really needs someone to sit back and really frame it up and sketch out how it's going to work. And then in a big way, when I'm doing work with clients and we're looking at implementing a system, I'm like, don't just pay attention to the happy path. That's great. That's easy to test. You can do that pretty quickly. It's all the places you can go off the rails, and putting the guardrails in there to keep that to a minimum. Best effort anyways. You're never going to get them all up front, but that's a huge part of engineering. And when you're building a product or an in-house application, however you want to frame it up, that's where the bulk of your effort should be. Realistically, it's, after you've designed something, is focusing on how are people going to misuse it, because people are creative. If you give them an inch, they're going to take a mile, and they're going to find some way to get their business, their jobs done quicker. And especially in the warehouse floor, I'm like, if you're incentivize them on some type of behavior, right, they're going to find ways to game the system. The bigger you are, the more games they play. It's just the reality of it, right? So there's all kinds of nuances there to it. But I don't know if you want me to go into an example of where I've recommended it, which, for full disclosure here, I've only done it a handful of times over the last 20 years. So that's how maybe biased or nuanced I am in that advice, right? So
no, I think that'd be good to hear a story about that. The other kind of layer that was popping in my mind as we were unpacking some of this is, generally speaking, again, back to the core competency comment, right? Generally speaking, when folks are developing their own tool, one of the areas that is a big pain point is documentation, right? Or lack thereof. And you see that even with, kind of canned software, so to speak, where sometimes the documentation is, not kind of bulletproof. So it exists in both worlds, but I do find that, if you compared the two of them, lights out, the canned stuff, you're going to have access to more help docs, walkthroughs, all kinds of things, as compared to, the homegrown stuff. And then what again creates a real issue for companies is, that brain drain happens, right? Something happens, somebody wins the lottery and moves on to, greener pastures. And then somebody is coming in after the fact, trying to figure things out. No documentation. There's no, detailed breakdown of table structures and, what data lives where and how different, modules are have been programmed, right? So, just tons and tons of complexity. But all that said, would love to hear, an example of where you actually recommended creating some custom software.
Sure. Yeah, actually, I like to touch on that topic we were just talking about here too, because that got me thinking. Uh, so, like a trade-off, effectively, when you're dealing with in-house application development or packaged software. Packaged software, you're way more prone to have some type of ecosystem out there where somebody has worked with the vendor or the software in a past, role or past life, whatever.
Yeah.
They're able to come in and help, even if you don't have the necessary documentation of your usage, which I'm a big proponent of. On the in-house side, I mean, I'm guilty as any other developer early on. I look back 20 years ago, I'm like, yeah, I would document, but I would document from my perspective, which is to say, very developer oriented. The engineering piece of it, where this is how these different algorithms work. They interact and relate the data model. But in terms of like actual usage and speaking to the functional user, good luck, right? That's another discipline there. Really, that wasn't something at that point in time I could articulate and take off one hat, put another hat on. It just wasn't there, at least back then, right? It's way younger, less mature. But that's something else right there that probably wouldn't be invested in, or it's going to require an investment. So you're going to have those people, and can you keep them busy full time, or is it a partial role? I mean, there's all these trade-offs you have. So that's another one of those pluses in my mind in terms of packaged software, is you're going to find some folks, you're more prone to have someone who can come in and step in and help that way and take what you have, pick up on it and run with it. So I'll kind of leave it there for now anyways. But in terms of an example, what was recent in my mind here is just the last few months, I went out and I worked with a company that does remanufacturing. So it's a commodity product, commodity market, right? So their pricing changes on a daily basis, where it's constantly in flux. So they'd be extremely flexible with, do we reprocess this, or do we sell it as we bring it in different quantities or group it together? So I mean, all kinds of variables there. They'd gone through several systems over the last few years, and none of them really stacked up, right? And now they have this. When I went out and visited them, we were trying to unwind it all. Is they do all kinds of weird processes based on requirements of those various systems. So it's another one of those Frankenstein models of, why do we do it? Well, we needed to at one point, and we never stopped doing it. So like, okay, well, job number one right here is to get your teams aligned and really figure out what you need to do, right, at a minimum, and get past, I did it because of this system, or I do it because of the current system. It's what do you really need to get down to? And when they showed me the systems that they have access to that play in this space, they're fairly basic. They're opinionated in ways where they're not flexible enough, and they're bigger than a lot of the typical customers that would use this. So they're all the edge cases in the are exposed. So when I was talking to the VP of IT, who actually also has an operations background, which is rare, but perspective was there in so many ways, right? He's thinking about the business in a way that I typically wouldn't see, at least in the same level. And he's investing in a team, and he outlined what he was trying to do, why he was doing it. And after I went away from my assessment, I came away and I'm like, yeah, I think that's the path. Like, I don't necessarily see another one here, because you could look outside your space at some packaged software, but you're going to have the same issues, maybe even more, because you're trying to fight it, and it's not designed for your type of business. You're going to need a lot of flexibility in there to change up how you do it. ABC paths like that, depending on what the commodities are going for. And then on top of that, they have some proprietary processes they need to build into workflows that help them find margin in scrap, because they do different things with it to cut it up and produce the gold that's inside of it, right? Not gold, but the nuggets, the valuable nuggets. So I'm like, you need workflows for that too. And And again, too, they're looking in the future, they're looking to replace their ERP. And one thing that the gentleman said, which I really resonated with, was we're going to be replacing our ERP. It's nearing end of life. But when we put one in, we're going to use it for what it was actually built for. And that's for finance and accounting. We're not going to try to shoehorn in operations, because that doesn't work for us. We need to be way too flexible for it. So they're working towards that. And the takeaway from my assessment was they want to bring me back in, and I'll be working with them for the next several months to answer questions and help them frame up how they're going to structure it, so they get the best of both worlds, right? I've been in this WMS space for a long time, so I can bring in a lot of the euphemisms and the patterns that I've seen that work well, and help them layer it into your software, so they're not reinventing the wheel and causing problems down the road, right? They're building something sound. And they have discipline. Some of the folks have actually built software that it's on their team. They brought in a good team. So they're going to have the concept of, I mean, not versions, but like, what are we trying to tackle right now? What's the priority? What do we need to get done? So we're like a minimum viable product. And that's uncommon, realistically, right? A lot of them are probably going to be, the companies that are thinking about building are going to be structured like the one I was in 20 years ago. And there's a whole lot more we don't know than we do know. And you jump, and then you're stuck with that course of action for a very long time. It's hard to get a leadership team to turn around and throw out an investment, whether it works or not, after they've sunk a bunch into it. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, what's interesting to me, and this has been on my mind since we kind of started the conversation, but that example that you kind of outlined with the custom software development, I mean, that company, I would place a sizable bet they would be equally successful identifying and ultimately configuring and implementing a off-the-shelf solution compared to the custom, and all for one reason, because they're doing the work to create the clarity, to define the process flows, to understand, and kind of optimize their business before they look at saying, like, what's the tool to execute? Yeah. Right. So I think that's the biggest, we kind of touched on it early on with the, kind of lack of roadmap thought process, but it's far greater than that, where a lot of businesses really struggle to, I don't say understand, but to articulate some of those really complex process flows, because obviously they understand them, they're doing them, right? Like they have a successful business, but when it comes to articulating that from a requirements perspective to a software vendor who is just used to, kind of selling and saying, like, sure, ours does that. Yeah, we can handle this. But both sides not knowing concretely how to navigate that conversation, I say that's where, the biggest breakdown is. So whether you're, on the path of custom development, or you're, utilizing that same process to ultimately define, shortlist, configure, implement off the shelf stuff, like, you got to go through that same series of steps if you want to have any chance of this stuff being, adopted successfully.
Oh, right. Yeah. That's something you said that triggered another thought in my head is, if you're going the build route, and even if you do the process clarity piece, there are some aspects and things to be watchful for. And is your process good, right? It's when you're talking to a vendor, and you could go a number of different ways. I've had good experiences, bad experiences, but someone who's going to challenge you on the way you operate, right? You could be right. You could be in the right here, where this is something critical to you, and it's the hill you die on to an extent. But there's also the opportunity to push back and say, well, if you tweaked a couple pieces of this process, you're going to fit a mold that you didn't before, and maybe you'll get some better mileage long term. Because that's how the industry works versus this thing you guys baked in house, right? As you were figuring out and building up and scaling up your business. So there's some pushback that way that might not be there in the build sense. That's assuming that you're not necessarily spending a lot of time looking to buy, right? It's like that premature kind of delineation of, there's nothing out here for us, we're just going to build, right? That due diligence piece. But yeah, I mean, all around, I'm a big fan of clarity first, right? And that's my whole first service with any client I bring in. I wholeheartedly believe in that because of the fact that people are not necessarily great at articulating requirements. Processes live in people's heads way more
Yeah.
than they want to believe. And I use an example all the time. Like you can come up with a question that seems fairly innocuous, right? Like it's simple. You ask somebody in a room, like a group of people, and you might get multiple answers. And when you do, that's a telltale sign that your processes aren't as well defined and equally distributed to all the people as you thought they were. And that's the time for slowing down and getting through that and making sure that you do arrive at something that everyone agrees to, and all those little weird requirements are surfaced, and some of them go away because maybe they're old, and other ones are picked up because only some of them knew it, and they're potentially making mistakes.
Yeah.
That's we were going back, we were talking about people moving on and being susceptible to brain drain, right? That concept that works. That's an issue no matter what, potentially, when it comes to getting ready for the system. Either you build or you buy is getting past the tribal knowledge piece, the local knowledge. Is one of my friends said today on LinkedIn that caught my eye, is getting that pulled from people's heads, so that way everyone knows about it. That way people can be promoted. They can win the lottery and you can wish them well versus dreading the day that it's their last day, or any other kind of variation of that. And those are the kinds of things that don't necessarily get the mind share that they should, or the buy-in across the group that they should. And that's just something else to be mindful of for the audience here listening.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's all good stuff. The other part of, some of the kind of brain drain aspect of it, for folks out there is again, going through this thought process of, it impacts different layers throughout the organization, right? So to kind of, span out a little bit, obviously it depends on what your org structure is, how big your organization is. But the point is that not just with the brain drain aspect and kind of the maintenance and all of the different, pieces that we've already talked about, right? But back to the kind of articulation and the process flows that live within those, certain people's heads, right? Like there's a different expectation in some circles of leadership, let's say senior leadership, compared to, those middle management layers, compared to, folks that are kind of closer to the ground and individual contributors, right? So everybody is looking at a different set of requirements and or process flows within these things. And then again, you have that layer of complexity with, people moving on and cycling in and people bringing outside perspective into all of this, right? So that's just one more thing, to navigate in this type of decision-making process, whether you look to build or buy, how you frame those requirements, how you ultimately articulate them. And, all of, I'd say for all of those reasons, that's, why you see these, technology, adoption and failure rates that you do. Because a lot of times we rush those things. We rush that decision making. And you don't want to get into the, analysis paralysis, right? But there's something sound about slowing down, getting clarity first, because these are big investments, even for a small company, a really small company. Let's just take a startup doing a couple $1,000,000 a year, right? Like, you start talking about a $10, $20, $50,000 investment. That's a real number to a company doing $2 million top line revenue, right? And then just start adding zeros and talking about more mature businesses and $500,000 implementations and, $2 million implementations, right? All that stuff's real.
Oh yeah. Yeah, for sure. The way you were talking, I had a couple other like stories or ideas pop in my head too. So that business that I was talking about where I built software 20 years ago, after I moved on, I kept in touch with the folks. One of my best friends worked there. We're super tight. he was there for years. Towards the end, they got acquired, and the business was on the hook to effectively. They were kind of like they needed him way more than he needed them. So they were throwing money at him to make sure he stayed there because he was the only person who knew how the system worked in an intimate detail, across all of it. So it worked out great for him, but at the same time, a huge liability for the business.
Sure.
They were trying like crazy to figure out how to replace that system with the one that the parent company had, and without losing information. And so, I mean, that's one of those other like untalked about risks out there, anyways, is going from that kind of system. But I also this was probably maybe 10, 15 years ago. I worked with a really big company, a software vendor I worked with. I was on the consulting side, huge company, multi-billions. They were coming off of a system that they had built in-house, 25 years there. They had a couple people that were getting ready to retire that knew all the information. So they were looking for packaged software. And they made a huge critical error, and that was they wanted to take what they had built in-house and make the packaged software do the same thing. And it was, for better or worse, they were miles apart.
Oh yeah.
So then they spent a ton of money adapting and tweaking to make the vendor software work the way that this old homebrew system worked. And they had so many issues. It couldn't be supported by the vendor. They had to hire a bunch more people. It took way longer than it was supposed to take. And then a few years later, when that version was no longer supported, and they were forced to upgrade based on the whole older, on-premise installable software kind of notion that's still pretty much out there in the incumbents. They had this massive price tag on this upgrade and retrofit and bringing everything, uplift kind of scenario. And one of the guys I was on the project with years later, he called me. He's like, I just got a call from that client that we were on that 3-year project. And the first thing out of their mouth was, we should have listened to you, because they're paying the price now. And
yeah.
If they don't do something different, which actually, I mean, at that point in time, you look at it, it's do we spend all the money to uplift this and pull forward our customized monstrosity, or do we go out and look at a different vendor, or maybe the same vendor but just start over? So and it's a huge number, huge dollar amount that no one envisioned. You couldn't warn them about. They were very much like, this is how we're going to do it. And that's the shame. And it's not the first time I've seen that. I mean, I've heard all kinds of horror stories, whether I was a part of them or not. But
yeah, I've seen similar things in my experience as well. And it is a great point in terms of being at the kind of crossroads, so to speak, where you look at going from, the custom back to canned or off the shelf configurable software, and then, not taking the opportunity to revisit a lot of those process flows. And again, I think most of that falls into the category of, those kind of siloed expectations. So you've got decision makers and leadership looking at, one area of the business, one aspect of it, and then not involving, the kind of individual contributors and the stakeholders that have a real touch to the process to understand like what wasn't working about our process flows to begin with. And then again, just to reiterate your other point, that configurability can get people in trouble, like for a boatload of reasons, right? Mm-hmm. One, lots of expense from a consulting and configuration standpoint, depending on who you're working with and how the, kind of partner structure is set up. But two, what a lot of folks don't realize, and you very briefly touched on this, but especially in the kind of SaaS world, right? As releases are being, constantly pushed out, if you have a lot of customization on a particular release, a particular revision level, there is an immense amount of testing that has to be done internally for all of those process flows and all of that data to ensure that nothing breaks, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so behind the scenes, a lot of times in these especially sizable organizations, the IT department is kind of, pulling their hair out because it's like we're 6 releases behind where the market is at. And that's because we don't have enough time to test to make sure that all the customization things that the businesses needed to operate are functional to push the releases through. So now what else, right? Like you introduce security vulnerabilities,
Right.
you miss out on feature sets that maybe you've asked for, that maybe you custom built, but are now a part of the actual commercial release, right?
Oh,
There's
yeah.
all these crazy complexities that happen with this stuff.
That actually just happened. I don't know all the specifics. I saw the headlines and I cringed because I understand the situation, but Blue Yonder.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if they talked about Blue Yonder in an article, but I think they even referred to the old name before they rebranded was JDA. Their warehouse management system. There's several big clients out there that were, I guess, like victims of ransomware because it was in older versions. There was an exploit identified, and they were able to find and get into these systems. And I wish I had more information because I'm not like a current events kind of guy that way, but it goes to show like there are a lot of old versions of these really big WMSs out there. These incumbent vendors, they would love to be cloud native, but just the tail of all their clients, all the releases out there, it's going to take a long time to get there.
Yeah.
But then you have all these older ones here with exploits and moving from on-premise where you could lock the network down massively to we're now putting in the cloud, and we're calling it cloud, but it's really just hosted. There's potential for opening something up because you get to talk to networks, and then someone else, a bad actor, can get in the middle and cause all kinds of mayhem. So
Yeah.
I don't know how that all landed. I don't know if it's still playing out. I just saw that and I cringed going, I've been wondering. It's one of those things that was inevitable at some point. I couldn't believe it hadn't happened, or at least I guess maybe it just hasn't, made the news cycle big enough where it hits some of my newsletters I watch or I read anyway. So I'm like, oh, wow, WMS is in the news. Okay.
Yeah.
A big vendor like that. Okay.
But I mean, the whole point is, right, it happens, and it happens probably more frequently than anybody really hears about. And, to me, it's like, these are the conversations that are the most valuable for folks that are, in the kind of growth stage businesses where this is a real issue for them because, again, going back to how we started the conversation, there is no black and white answer, 1 and 0, to this stuff. There's just, shades of gray and, understanding the risk factors, understanding, where this fits into your kind of overall, tech stack strategy,
Right.
ability to operate your business, right? That's what makes this stuff so challenging. So it's always interesting to see companies want to rush these conversations because of that, with, again, maybe rose-colored glasses, not thinking, they could literally get themselves into a situation where they can invoice for weeks or months at a time. I've literally seen that where, a company was not able to generate invoices. Imagine what that would do to your business,
Exactly.
even for a week.
Right. You hear about all that stuff on the ERP side of the fence, but if you're shipping product as a core part of your business, that interchange from the WMS back to the ERP and any kind of failures there can have almost the same effect, right? It's You're not recognizing revenue, and that's the lifeblood of your business. And so cash flow goes down, all kinds of people start looking, and stress levels go up, and it's all avoidable, right? But a lot of that, like you spoke to the concept of urgency, and I say this over and over again to the prospects I talk to, the clients I end up landing, is it's never too early to start understanding your options and getting out there. And that's kind of the beauty of my assessment. Really, is I'm not necessarily looking to sell you anything. I'm looking to answer some questions for you, so what's coming next. And there's almost always going to be some homework. So the earlier you do this, the more time you have to clarify and fix processes, get your teams aligned, all those kinds of things. That way, when you are ready to go, you know what you're doing. You even know how to talk to vendors versus just going out there and getting stuck in those demo doom loops that people, unwittingly get themselves in all the time. But the urgency piece, I mean, that speaks to, well, I guess most of the time when I see it, I bump into it, there's some type of external event that's driving the fear or the need to change. And another one of those misnomers that I deal with all the time is just because you're looking to buy software doesn't mean this is just a technology project. Like you and I were talking about the clarity, the process pieces there. This is much more of like a business maturity project, if you want to call it a project.
Yeah, I would go further and say it's absolutely not a technology project.
No, that's a small piece of it. You need to put it in perspective.
That's the literal smallest piece of it.
Yeah. That's like the glue and the concrete to kind of like form up what you've built, in terms of the foundation that you're my analogies are all junk right here. But yeah, there's something going in my head in terms of like building the house, and like, the software is like the last piece of it all. But
yeah, it's like stacking blocks and forgetting the mortar. Okay. Like that's right. It ends up, I think like, a story from my past that kind of illustrates your same thought process. I was once tasked with relocating a sizable business. And I thought going into it, because I'd never done it before, right? I thought that the biggest problem was like moving the equipment, right? Because we're talking about, tons of, literal tons, right? In terms of weight, right? But, hundreds of pieces of equipment, truck after truck. And it's like, how do you plan through cycling it down? How do you get the, the pneumatics and the electrical and the foundation? How do you do all that? And it's like, turns out, right? Easiest part of the whole thing was doing the equipment. It was all the other stuff, it was the people element, the change management required on both sides of that to make that, successful. And I say the same thing about this. It's, it's very little about, kind of ultimately which tool you implement. It's all the other elements to that, because all of that is what's going to make or break, the kind of longevity, the success, the adoption of said tool, So again, the tool becomes much less important, than the change management element, the people, the process, the planning, that's required. So.
I mean, shoot, you go back to the change management thing, and you were talking before about the folks that are closer to the floor on the operation, and you have the senior leadership. But at least in my world, anyways, the circle I run in to an extent, yet you hear about all the WMS implementations that go sideways, or the adoptions hurt, or they're failures for one reason or another, and it almost always boils down to communication issues. It's leadership pushing something or perceived to push something on the folks that actually use the system. It's missed requirements because no one talked to them to connect the dots. So that way, for one, they felt like they're actually part of the solution, right? Like, I know how my job's going to change, and it needs to change because we have these business objectives. It's not just being pushed on me. And, I'm frustrated because, I like the way I used to work. I was used to it. I came in, I could do it, before I had my full cup of coffee. Now it's like, I got to relearn this. Do I want to? It seems dumb. Maybe something got harder, but there was a reason for it versus like the net improvement, in their particular job function.
Yeah.
But those are, you can get by those if you slow down early on and you work on process clarity. And that means talking to all these different voices and making sure it's comprehensive, because there's a lot of goals, there's nuggets on the folks, with the people that are on the floor out there, because they're the last touch point between you and the customer. And, there's things that they might be doing or ways to be efficient that, aren't necessarily documented, right? They've kind of come up with that whole localized knowledge I was talking about before. And if you lose that, you're basically taking a step backwards, at least in their job functions themselves, and setting yourself up for some pain.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, like one of the issues that you'll see to that point is, No, sometimes there's a strategic decision for a particular outcome that's being sought that requires, let's say, a particular department to become less efficient. So it's less efficient for Department A to do this particular process, this particular way, utilizing this particular tool. But when we look at it from a macro perspective, right, it's better for the organization. The thing that often gets missed in that is explaining to that, Department A, why did we pick this tool? Why are we picking this process flow? And why is it important that, you are ultimately less efficient in your role? And how does that contribute to the greater good of the company? And again, you look at that exact same example and you do all of those things, but you don't explain any of that. And then, you hit it earlier in the conversation, but you have people who inherently will look for ways to kind of skirt the system, right? Because they are seeking efficiency. We are, like bred to become as efficient as possible, to do as little as possible. So without those conversations across your organization, up and down your organization, the organization is going to struggle when it comes to, again, it doesn't matter if we're talking about building it or buying it. You've got the same, set of challenges when it comes to, implementation and ultimately adoption.
Yeah, those are all very universal.
Yeah. Well, man, we've somehow managed to burn up a bunch of time on this conversation, which doesn't surprise me at all. But as we kind of get ready to land the plane, any final thoughts in terms of companies that are thinking about or in a position to start thinking about the buy versus build conversation?
Right. I would say it's never too early to start looking and investigating, getting some outside reference points, having people look at your operation and just give you some ideas there. The fact that I know, at least I imagine we share the same kind of size clients, maybe the small to mid-sized businesses. When you're looking at a consultant for the first time, you get all these preconceived notions, but there's one of the benefits really is they've seen a lot of different businesses, operations, personalities, cultures, and importantly, they've seen a lot of failure, right? So there's things that they can bring in and articulate that to you. So that's something worthwhile to invest in. And some of the best ones, they help you start small. They're not coming in to have you spend crazy amounts of money at first, right? There's a rapport piece, but just building that out and getting comfortable with what they're saying. And, sometimes you resonate with them, sometimes you don't, but that's a huge thing right here before you partake in whatever path you go down. And I had to say, the vendor, or not the vendor, but the company that I worked with, that I did say, you know what, maybe it makes sense to build. They had another unique aspect. Well, I wouldn't say unique, but it was something that was definitely relevant to the conversation. Was they're growing through mergers and acquisitions right now, mostly acquisitions, right, and the mergers necessarily, but they need a faster way to pull these smaller companies into the fold. So there's a rationale for investing in their systems that give them some kind of competitive advantage, and they're going to get the scale long term out of that. That was one of those big things where it changed my mind to an extent. Like, yeah, this isn't just a company that's going to probably stay the same size, and they're putting a lot of money into software. They're looking to grow that, and they have an idea of how to go out and pull in more and more businesses into their network. And at that point, you get the economies of scale, and you have something that their competitors don't have, right? At that,
Yeah.
So that was a call out. Nothing else polished at the moment, right? We talked about a bunch of different topics, so yeah. I'm sure as soon as we end this, I'm like, oh, there's 3 more things, but it's nature of the game.
Awesome, man. Well, Casey, is always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for coming back on the Everyday Business Problems podcast, man.
All right, man. Have a good one.
Thanks.
All right. Take care.
Thank you so much for listening today. If we brought you any value, please rate, subscribe, and share our podcast. Also, be sure to connect with us on social media by searching @The Crysler Club. Until next week, I'm your host, Dave Crysler.